Record. All right. Well, good morning, everyone. Hope you guys all had a good weekend. I hope you guys are excited for all the cool topics we're going to be covering this week. So we're going to start off today with community ecosystem ecology. So we're going to get really big, talk about big concepts. Then we're going to continue sort of thinking about those big concepts tomorrow. And we're talking about biodiversity and conservation. Then we're going to keep staying big, but get slightly more depressing and talk about waste and microplastics. And then we're going to sort of wrap up the week thinking about how science is done, because while I would normally like to talk about climate change here, I think we need to sort of preface the next couple things and talk about how science is done first, the scientific method, so that we can sort of look at these topics that are for some reason controversial, including public health and vaccines and microbiome and climate change, and sort of get a really nice background about science, how it's done, and sort of the pitfalls of it, so then we could sort of better understand these topics of last week. So that being said, as I'm sure you guys all know, you guys got points for your weekly number 4 already, and weekly number 5 is also posted on Blackboard. It's just multiple choice questions, so make it a little faster for you this week. And in addition, your short paper is also due this week, the 12th. So if you have not sent me your topic yet, please do it. So just so I can make sure it's okay. I also posted the rubric on Blackboard. So if you go to the short paper section of the assignments, and you'll see there's a rubric there. You can check it out. Let me know if you have any questions. It's pretty straightforward. I'm mostly on the desire for short papers. You don't need to, write super long papers. This isn't a history class or an English class. You're writing for a scientist. So I like short sentences. I like, succinct ideas. Make this feel like you would write it for yourself, right? Like, how much do you want to read? And, picture like how much I would want to read. And when I have grade 35 of these, I don't want to read a lot. So you can take all your ideas and distill them down into, smaller chunks of text. That's always the best, and it'll also keep you more focused and stuff like that. But again, you're going into a topic that we might not have covered. So if you have any questions, please let me know. If you have any issues, understanding things, again, just let me know. But with that, one last thing. I'm going to post a extra credit assignment to Blackboard. This is going to be a waste audit. So you're going to have to basically, for 3 or 4 days, you're going to have to look at what you generate for waste, keep tabs on it, what types of plastics, things like that. So this will be a nice little extra credit assignment, get you thinking about yourself and get you, sort of in the theme of, this week and next week, which are, sort of world issue problems. So, but with that, let's get started. So today we're going to be covering community and ecosystem ecology. And so this is my second favorite class to teach, because I really enjoy being outside. I really enjoy thinking sort of big scales. And when we're sort of thinking about ecosystems, we're thinking about the biggest scale that we can possibly imagine, outside of sort of thinking of how the globe itself functions. And so just as a reminder, when we talked about this last class, ecology is simply the study of organisms and how they interact with their environment. And there are multiple levels to thinking about ecology. So we talked about the individual level, which is simply how an individual organism does its thing. We have populations, which are groups of the same species living in the same area. And then we have what we're going to talk about today is communities, where you have multiple types of species living in a defined area. So you could pretend like if we have this community here, we have lobsters and fish and mussels all living inside Boston Harbor. That would be a community of Boston Harbor. And then an ecosystem is simply scaling this up. If we said all of Massachusetts coastline, that would be an ecosystem. And that ecosystem includes communities, includes populations, it includes individuals, but it also getting us to think a little bit more about the sort of what are the environmental conditions in this area. Are we, we're seeing what temperatures, what's the sort of long-term climate, what is the pH, what's the salinity, things like that. So ecosystems sort of are a broad encompassing thing, includes biotic and abiotic components. And just as a refresher, when we say biotic, we're saying living things. And when we're saying abiotic, we're saying non-living things. And that can be, like the nutrients present. It could also just be rocks. So abiotic is basically anything that is not living in some capacity. And ecosystems, again, are comprised of our chemical, physical, and biological components. And so ecosystem is a broad category. And again, we have that biotic component, which is all the living things. So in this case, we have a coral reef as an ecosystem. And in our coral reef, all the biotic components are fish and corals and eels and all that fun stuff. And our biotic components are going to be things like water temperature, the current of the water, the salinity, pH, things like that. And depending on what is living in a given area and what the environmental conditions are, we get different physical we get different types of ecosystems, and these different types of ecosystems you've probably heard of before, but they all have different types of physical and chemical properties. And now these differences in physical and chemical properties lead us to have differences in biology. So if we just sort of look at some sort of big picture ecosystems out there, we can first start off looking at terrestrial ecosystems. So we can start off sort of just thinking here in Massachusetts, what we have temperate deciduous forests, and we also have coniferous forests here. So this is what Massachusetts has. And that's in contrast to, say, something like Africa, right? Africa has lots of desert, tropical rainforests, and savannas, right? Very, very different. You can just physically see how different they are, right? A desert is very, very dry, right? Temperate deciduous forest here is going to be very wet, lots of trees, right? Lots of vegetation. But just by looking at this, you can just visually see that the living sort of conditions here are very different, right? A desert's going to be dry, very, very, very little vegetation, which is going to lead to very, very few consumers and predators and things like that, which is in contrast to, again, to what we see here in Massachusetts, where we have lots of vegetation, lots of ideal conditions, lots of biomass, lots of living organisms. And again, that's all just simply dictated by the environmental conditions. A desert is very different than a forest. But again, all this changes in abiotic conditions lead to changes in the biology. You simply just don't see things that usually live in a desert in a forest, or you don't see things that live near the polar ice. You don't see them living in a temperate grassland. So the abiotic conditions, which are simply just determined by a few key factors we'll talk about in a moment, lead to all the differences in biology. And this is true on land, and this is also true in the water. And so you can just look at varying different types of aquatic ecosystems, whether it's a estuary or a wetland like we see pretty commonly here on the New England coastline, or you can look at something like a coral reef. Very, very different abiotic conditions, which in turn lead to very different biotic conditions. So they are linked to one another. Now, there are cases where the biology can dictate the abiotic conditions, but typically speaking, it's the conditions of the environment around our ecosystem that dictate what physically happens inside there. But ultimately, to sort of get at this idea of what's sort of driving the differences between these different types of ecosystems, we have to think about the sun. And sort of as we preface in the very sort of early classes where we talked about energy, the sun is really what's driving all the energy processes in our system, right? Energy from the sun is bathing the earth every day, right? Some of it's absorbed, and that warms the planet. A lot of it's reflected out, and some of it is absorbed by individuals which use it for photosynthesis, right? So solar energy is the starting point for thinking about how we differentiate between these different types of ecosystems. And the intensity of solar energy is essentially constant over space and time. So the intensity of light that hits the North Pole is the same as the intensity of light that hits the equator. But the key difference here is essentially how direct and how long the sun is physically hitting in space that determines how warm it is. And so the idea being here is, if we have our Earth, the Earth is always rotating on an axis. So you guys all know the Earth is round, it's not flat. There's no science that explains that the Earth is flat. The Earth is round. And the Earth is constantly spinning, right? That's how we get our day-night cycles, right? Just by the Earth revolving, every 23.5 hours or so, the Earth does one complete rotation. Now, the idea being here is when the Earth is spinning, it spins on an axis. So it has a slight tilt. So it's not perfectly vertical, right? As you can see from sort of this picture diagram here, the Earth has a slight tilt to it. And this tilt is not constant through time. It does vary, but it varies over very, very long time periods. You're talking about 50 to 60,000 year time periods. But currently speaking, the Earth is at a tilt of 23.5 degrees. It will get slightly it'll get slightly bigger and then come back eventually. But again, that's very, very long time frame that we don't, really think about for this class. But what you notice is because we have this tilt, essentially how much sunlight hits each spot is different, right? So you have something like the equatorial regions here, they get very, very direct sunlight, whereas our North Pole and South Pole get very, very indirect sunlight. The idea being is that the more essentially direct sunlight you can get, the warmer you're going to be. Now, it's not an intensity thing, right? The light that hits the North Pole or the South Pole is not less intense. It's the same intensity as what hits the equator. It's just simply the North Pole and the South Pole get less solar energy, which leads for them being colder. But the further you move away from this direct sunlight, the cooler you are. So as you all probably know, when you're at the equator, it's very warm, it's tropical, right? It's like that all year round. But as you move away from the equator, it gets colder and colder and colder until you get to the North Pole or the South Pole where it is frigid, right? And that's just simply all due to how much solar energy per area you get that determines how warm you are. And how warm you are will, as we'll see very shortly, determines what ecosystems you can physically have. The other thing I just want to make mention of is, because this is something typically people ask is how this relates to like seasons. And so this all relates to seasons by essentially how the Earth is facing the sun. So in this case, we have the northern hemisphere is facing directly the sun. So that angle is pointing towards the sun. This would indicate that it's going to be summer in the northern hemisphere. And it'll be winter in the southern hemisphere. Now, when this is the opposite, where the North Pole is essentially facing away from the sun and the South Pole is facing towards the sun, that would give us winter in the northern hemisphere and summer in the southern hemisphere. So that's just how seasons work here as well. So, just as a note. And so outside of our sun, the next important component when we're thinking about ecosystems is going to be water. As we all know, life can't exist without water. It is the biological medium. You are basically a giant bag of water walking around. And that's the same for every living being on this planet. Small or large, doesn't really matter. But how water moves through our ecosystems, how water moves through the planet is important for determining the distribution of ecosystems in addition to, again, this solar radiation. Now, when we're thinking about how water works, it's sort of this constant back and forth between what's in the atmosphere, so thinking about clouds, and what's sort of either on the surface or what's in lakes or the ocean or even rivers. Now, the idea being is, and I'm sure you guys have all heard this, is the sun warms the planet, right? And this warms the planet and it causes the water to evaporate. Right? It causes it to change from a liquid form to a gaseous form. So as it evaporates, it comes up, it evaporates, it essentially comes as a gas, it leaves the ground or the ocean or whatever and goes up into the atmosphere. And eventually it cools and condenses. And when we say condenses, it means it goes from a gas form back to a liquid form. So that's the cycle we're thinking about. Heating of the water turns it to a gas, brings it up to the atmosphere where it cools. Now, once it cools, it turns back into water. It eventually will be massive enough or heavy enough for it to essentially fall. And that falls in the form of rain or snow or sleet or hail or any of the sort of ways that water falls back down to the planet. But that's the cycle we're thinking, right? Sun, ground, evaporation, rain. Fun fact about rain, we now know that rain mostly forms not from dust particles as we previously believed, but actually a lot of the rain in the atmosphere in the clouds we're seeing actually form around pockets of bacteria up there. It's actually kind of cool. So bacteria get wafted up into the atmosphere because they're very small, very light, and they act as like seeds for clouds. They allow water to clump onto them. It allows water to start to clump onto itself, then forming clouds. But a lot of the clouds you see, not all of them, but a lot of them, are actually started by clumps of bacteria. So just when you thought you were done talking about bacteria, I always try to find a way to bring my bacteria back into the equation. So that's our water. Next up is going to be another important factor, and this is wind. And wind is something that is biologically important. As we talked about with plants, it's important for seeding, essentially dispersing pollen and seeds and stuff like that. So it is biologically important. But as you guys all know, wind is also provides a cooling factor, right? When there's a nice cool breeze, it's much, much cooler, right? So wind can help regulate temperature. Wind is formed through a number of different processes in sort of naturally speaking, but the most common way wind is produced is by changes in atmospheric pressure. And this is sort of a weird one to think about. Atmospheric pressure simply refers to the weight of air above you, and it changes based upon how much water and other factors are there. But atmospheric pressure is just, again, how much weight is above you. You don't really think about it, but there's weight above you. I know it's a weird sort of concept to think about, but there is. So air has weight. And so atmospheric pressure is the weight of that air. And when we think about how wind forms, subtle changes in that atmospheric pressure essentially cause changes in air currents. And this changes in atmospheric pressure are commonly done through heating and cooling of air. Again, all solar radiation or the lack of solar radiation. And subtle changes in this pressure essentially force air currents. So you could think about if you have like a whoopee cushion, right? You fill it with air and then you press down on the whoopee cushion. Well, it makes a little fart noise, but it pushes air out, right? And that's the idea. We have subtle changes in pressure, forcing air to move from one place to the other, thus creating wind. I know it's a weird thing to sort of think about, but that's the gist of how wind forms. There's other ways that wind forms, but that's the primary way wind is forming. Again, weird, thinking about weight of air, but air does have an overall weight. And so those are the sort of the three main things: water, solar radiation, and wind. Those are sort of the key things here when we're thinking about how things form. But one of the sort of the byproducts of these three factors is going to be a process called desertification. I've been saying this word for years and I still have trouble saying it. But when we say this word, that I'm not going to try to say again, it's simply the formation of deserts. And so when we're making deserts, it's sort of like a perfect storm of events where we're having not a lot of water, not a lot of wind, and lots of solar radiation. So the idea being is that deserts form at 30-degree latitudes. And the idea being is as you have the equator here at 0 degrees latitude, you have these air currents that pull in the warm air, essentially coming up into the atmosphere, and then it essentially comes back down. So you have these air currents, as you can see here, at every 30 degrees, and they essentially circulate air throughout. And now, one of the sort of things that's interesting about deserts is they always form at 30 degrees north, or they form at 30 degrees south. Now, the idea being here is that, as you all know, and you can see from this picture, deserts are very dry and cool. Essentially, these air currents, the way it works is it essentially pulls away moisture and it dumps hot air into these spots of 30 degrees north and 30 degrees south, creating these very, very, very dry conditions. In sort of connection with that, at 60 degrees north, you have essentially a lot of warm air being pulled up. What this does is create lots of clouds. So you have very, very heavy rains at 60 degrees north and 60 degrees south. So you get this dual process. So you get all the world's deserts essentially form at 30 degrees. So you'll notice that, the American Southwest is here. The Gobi Desert in China is over here. The Sahara is right at 30 degrees. The Atacama Desert's down here. So all our deserts form at these 30 degrees simply because are these sort of overall air currents. So I hope you can see sort of how air can really have a dramatic effect by essentially pulling water away, pulling in heat, causing essentially a pretty large change in the ecosystem that would be at that 30 degrees north or 30 degrees south. In addition, one of the other things we commonly see with rain is what are called rain shadows. And so we see this on the Sierra mountain range out in California. And the idea being is that if you have an ecosystem like California, where lots and lots of air currents are pulling nice, warm, liquidy water off the ocean, it pulls it in, and it starts to cause, as it pulls it in, it causes rainstorms along the coast of California. So once it hits the mountain range, it's kind of an interesting thing. it leads the air to rise and cool. And once air sort of really rises and cools, it loses its capacity to hold a lot of water. Really, really warm air is good at holding water. So think about like a hurricane, right? Hurricanes are fueled by really warm air because really warm air holds a lot of water. Now, the idea of once cool air or once any air hits a mountain, it gets pushed up because that's just sort of the natural slope of a mountain. It loses some of its water, and thus, when the air makes it over the back end of the mountain, it doesn't have very much water, which leads to what are called rain shadows. And now, rain shadows are simply areas that are on one side of the mountains, essentially has no water, so it's going to become a partial desert or very, very dry. And then you have on the other side of the mountain, the air essentially stalls before it can make it over the mountain. So it gets really, really wet, leading to really, really wet and not tropical rainforest, but very, very wet forests. So this is one way sort of the mountain ranges can affect the formation of different types of ecosystems as well. And then sort of as a final note about sort of, major sort of ways that structures can affect weather is actually humans. So one of the sort of interesting things about cities is we actually influence weather. And so you can imagine tall buildings, or if you've ever been down to, say the financial district in Boston, down by South Station or the aquarium, there's lots and lots of tall buildings there. And all those tall buildings act to redirect air, and they act to redirect air, and they make essentially like wind tunnels, right? And so cities can act to direct air currents, changing the airflow patterns. So that's just one way cities do it. Another way is our building materials, so asphalt, cement, concrete, as well as the tops of buildings, which are typically black, actually absorb a lot of heat. And so you can see in this sort of schematic of a city, you have areas that are very red, including the buildings and the roads and stuff like that, meaning they're very, very hot because they absorb a lot of heat from the sun. And that's in contrast to sort of more natural areas, which are very, these cooler colors because they're not absorbing as much heat. So one of the interesting things you get in cities is what's called the urban heat island effect, meaning that all this sort of city material is absorbing lots and lots of heat, making the cities warmer than the surrounding areas. So I live, about 30 miles outside the city. It is about 10 to 15 degrees cooler where I live because there's not as much concrete and building materials than it is in Boston. Just simply because there's none of those building materials. So cities themselves can physically act to dramatically shape weather and stuff like that. And I'll just preface this by saying we're talking about weather, so this is short-term patterns in sort of the environmental conditions. We're going to talk about climate next week, which is long-term patterns. So there is a very sort of stark difference between weather and climate, as we'll discuss. But just wanted to foreshadow it. And sort of next up is sort of our aquatic habitats. We have oceanic currents. And so oceanic currents, all due to warming and cooling of waters. There's currents that move water all the way around the planet. Our ocean isn't stagnant. It mixes both, from the land to the sea and all the way around the globe. Our water in our oceans is constantly mixing, not just around at the surface, but there's also currents that go down to the bottom of the ocean, pulling in water and stuff from down below, or pulling up and stuff like that. So there is oceanic currents all around the globe, and you'll notice that some are warmer, some are cooler. But these oceanic currents themselves are all sort of dictated by the warming at the equator and the cooling down at the poles as well. But all these currents also act to shape ecosystems. So you get, just for instance, the way, you have ecosystems here on the European coast. Well, as you'll notice, there's a nice little current here that brings in nice warm water to the European coast, which essentially creates nice warm climates here in Europe, which allows a different type of ecosystem. Because you would imagine, well, what you would see, not really imagine, but if this warm current wasn't here, Europe would be much, much colder. So these oceanic currents do create some pretty dramatic changes in ecosystems where they are affecting. And sort of the one last interesting topic that we're going to discuss, and you'll hear this every 2 to 7 years or 2 to 10 years, it just varies from year to year, is this idea South America. And what this does is it drives warm water away from South America towards Australia. And what this does is it's by pushing all this. Oh, my sound went off. Am I good now? Can you guys hear me? Okay. Sorry about that. I don't know. I don't understand my internet. It should work great. It doesn't. It's a jerk. Okay, so we're going to talk about El Nino and La Nina. So you hear about this every 2 to 7 years, sometimes a little bit longer. And so this is this interesting phenomena off the coast of South America. And the idea being is you have these westerly winds off the coast of South America pushing all this warm water from South America all the way over to Australia. Not like Australia needs to be hotter, but this is how things normally work. And what this does is it pushes the water towards Australia. And what this causes is that nice cold water from deep does what's called upwelling. So essentially, by moving away the warm water, it's being replaced by cold, deep water. And this cold, deep water brings with it lots and lots of nutrients to feed lots of fishes. And one of the sort of the main fishing industries off the coast of South America is things like mackerel and sardines. And so this is La Nina. So this is normal conditions. Again, warm water being pushed up, causing cold water to upwell, feeding a very, very vibrant fishery. Now, this is in contrast to El Nino. El Nino is essentially a shutdown of those westerly winds, causing all that hot water to stay on the coast of South America. And what this does is it does not allow the cold water to upwell. And what it does is it essentially doesn't bring all this delicious food for the fishing industry, and it essentially causes a shutdown of the fishing industry. So this does two things. It causes a pretty huge change in the biology here, right? We're not having all these fish being fed by all this cold water coming up. But what ends up happening is the climate, or essentially the weather and the climate in this area for short periods of time becomes much, much hotter. So during an El Nino year, South America basically becomes, I mean, it's already pretty hot, but it becomes much, much, much hotter and much drier. But during a normal year, what you see is actually South America is essentially much cooler and Australia becomes much hotter. So you have this sort of, again, this is sort of a naturally occurring phenomena. You hear about this again every couple of years, and it causes some pretty serious changes in the ecosystems in these areas, both South America as well as Australia. And so those are sort of all the ways that ecosystems are affected, all the abiotic factors that can come together to affect ecosystems. But now we're going to think about ecosystems in terms of energy. And so our second class together, we talked about energy because biology is essentially about how energy moves through systems. And this energy, again, is all in the form of chemical energy, right? We're thinking about carbon-based molecules that organisms can break down and respire, right? And you get that ATP, right? And there is an overall cycle to how things move through ecosystems. And energy, essentially, we talk about it flowing through ecosystems. And we start off with essentially limitless energy from the sun. And this energy from the sun is captured by our primary producers, so our plants and our bacteria and our algae and stuff like that. And through the process of photosynthesis, it is converted into sugars, right? That's how photosynthesis works. And once these primary producers produce their sugars, they can then be eaten by what are called primary consumers. And so these are just individuals that eat primary producers. So these are things like herbivores, insects, things like that. And these primary consumers can then be eaten by secondary consumers, and those secondary consumers are eventually eaten by tertiary consumers. And so when I say energy flows through the system, again, it's starting at the sun, it's converted into chemical energy by the trees, and then it goes through a chain of events where it's eaten by something bigger and bigger and bigger. So this is what I mean by flowing through an ecosystem. It passes from one organism to the next by that organism consuming them. And sort of one of the interesting things about this is the energy gets more concentrated as it moves up. And what I mean by more concentrated, it's essentially things are typically getting bigger. So things that are primary consumers are small, secondary consumers are slightly bigger, and tertiary consumers and so on and so forth are much, much bigger. So the energy is getting more concentrated. You're essentially, taking a lot of energy that you would find in, say, a tree, and you're making one small individual as it moves up this food chain here. And this leads to changes in what we call biomass. And so biomass is the weight of organisms in an ecosystem. And when we look at the vast majority of ecosystems, about 90% of that biomass is actually in our primary producers. So if you went out to a forest behind you or anywhere in Massachusetts, the vast majority of that biomass would be in the plants, would be in the microbes. And the idea being is that the vast majority of that biomass is in these primary producers. Now, some of that biomass is consumed, about 10% by primary consumers, and about 10% of the biomass of the primary consumers is eaten by the secondary consumers, and so on and so forth. And so you get this ratio of about 10% of the biomass at each of these levels is used to essentially for cellular respiration, to essentially make energy to power these individuals. And another 10% moves up to the next food chain by something eating something below it. And so this is how energy in the term of mass is moving through ecosystems. But again, all of it starts down here. You have to have a lot more biomass in producers to feed much bigger things, but simply because as you get bigger and bigger, you need to eat more stuff, right? So if you think about a tiger needs to eat a lot of meat relative to, say, a bird, simply because they're just very, very different in size. And so as I mentioned, this is typically the way things are. You have some weird ecosystems where you have you have less producer biomass than consumer biomass, but those are just sort of one-off cases. They're not that common. The most common way things are in nature is lots and lots of primary producer biomass, little bit of consumer biomass. And the way this biomass moves through ecosystems leads us to the carbon cycle. So the carbon cycle simply refers to how carbon, which again is the sort of the most important biological element out there. Remember, you are about 25% carbon, if I remember that statistic correctly. And remember, carbon makes up all the important parts of you, right? It makes apart your lipids, which make up your membranes, right? It makes up your DNA, it makes up your protein. So carbon and how it moves through ecosystems is pretty important. And so the carbon cycle, again, how carbon moves through an ecosystem, is an important process. And sort of the interesting thing about the carbon cycle, and we're going to talk about a few other cycles in a minute, is it has biotic and abiotic components to it. And so when we look at sort of a mock carbon cycle here, it all starts off with atmospheric carbon or atmospheric CO2. Right? I'm sure you guys have all heard of carbon dioxide at some point. Now, we know that there is anthropogenic or human-based sources of CO2. So whenever we combust fossil fuels, so whenever you drive a car, turn on your TV, you're producing carbon dioxide. So that's the sort of human ways we can put carbon dioxide in the atmosphere. But that carbon dioxide is also produced by the respiration of plants and the consumers that eat them. So if you remember back from our class about respiration, one of the byproducts of making ATP inside of any cell produces carbon dioxide. So carbon dioxide makes it back up to the atmosphere either through respiration of individuals in an ecosystem or by humans dumping it there through our activities. But that atmospheric carbon is not biologically useful until a plant takes it, combines it with water and solar energy, and it does photosynthesis, right? So it fixes that carbon into sugar. Now, once that carbon is fixed into sugar, that can then be eaten. And once it's eaten, that carbon then is used to make biomass of all these different levels. Now, that's sort of the way we're going, right? So photosynthesis is bringing this carbon into sugars. It's being eaten by bigger things, which use it to make their tissues. And those living beings are respiring that carbon back into the atmosphere. So you have this nice natural cycle, right? Photosynthesis, respiration, they're balanced. But there is a third avenue here that we need to think about. And this is what happens when things die. And I'm sorry about that. Everything dies. There's nothing that is ever persisting in nature. So once things die, things will be returned some fashion. So they'll either go into the soil or they'll go into the water or sediment or something like that. And once they're there, we have organisms called either detritivores or decomposers that essentially take all that biomass. So if we have, say, a bird die, we have organisms that will eat that bird, that dead bird, and convert it back into CO2. And so there is this overall cycle here, and where we have, again, a balance between respiration, which is either living things are doing or things that are consuming dead things are doing, and photosynthesis. So you have this nice balance, naturally speaking. But again, humans do, and as we'll talk about next week, humans are adding more and more CO2 to the atmosphere as well. But again, the carbon cycle is just this sort of cycle, the circular motion between atmosphere, plants, consumers, atmosphere, plants, consumers, over and over again. And naturally speaking, this is in balance. So there, the atmosphere would not accumulate more CO2 if this was perfectly in balance. So that's the carbon cycle. Next up is our nitrogen cycle. And so this is important because nitrogen is the third most important element on the planet for life. If you remember, it is, about 6% of your biomass. And if you remember sort of the structure of DNA proteins, nitrogen is a crucial component of DNA and proteins. You have your nitrogenous bases in your DNA. It all has nitrogen in it. So nitrogen and how it moves through ecosystems is very important. And like CO2, like the carbon cycle, there is biotic and abiotic components. And so it all starts again in the atmosphere here. 79% of the atmosphere is diatomic nitrogen or atmospheric nitrogen or N2. This atmospheric nitrogen can be brought down into the biosphere by bacteria called nitrogen fixing bacteria. And once that nitrogen is brought down into the soil or into the ocean, it's in the form of ammonia, or essentially a fertilizer. And that ammonia that's brought down from the atmosphere can then be essentially cycled through different things. So this bacteria, once it dies, it releases its nitrogen into the soil. That can potentially be picked up by a plant or some other primary producer, which then can be consumed by something bigger. So this is how nitrogen moves through the system. It's brought into the system solely by bacteria, and then is then essentially passed through the chain, right, as things eat things below it. There is a final avenue here, very much like the carbon cycle. Organisms don't respire nitrogen. Like when we eat something that has nitrogen in it, we don't put nitrogen back into the atmosphere. There is a special type of bacteria out there that will take this nitrogen that is useful for biology and convert it back into gases, just as a note. So this is the nitrogen cycle. It all starts with bacteria, it ends with bacteria. So it is a pretty heavily bacterially mediated process. That being said, the carbon cycle also is a pretty heavily bacterial mediated process. Don't want to say that the bacteria aren't important everywhere. And sort of the final and one of the other important biological cycles we need to think about is the phosphorus cycle. And as you know, phosphorus is important. It's the fourth most important element after nitrogen and carbon and oxygen. It is an important component of your proteins. It is an important component of your lipids. It is an important component of ATP. Right? So phosphorus is important. And phosphorus is mostly abiotic in process, and there is limited amounts of biology involved in how phosphorus moves. And we're not going to talk about too much in depth, but just to know that most of phosphorus is stored in rocks, and most of the way phosphorus moves around is through water. There's not a lot of whole biology that's involved with moving phosphorus from one organism to the next. And so we talked about sort of these three key cycles. One of the other important things about ecosystems are what we call limiting nutrients. And what a limiting nutrient is essentially what limits primary production in ecosystems. And this varies depending on what ecosystem you're in. So if you're in a desert, water is what limits primary production. And when I say primary production, just to reiterate, it's plants photosynthesizing. And so in a desert, what limits plants from photosynthesizing a lot is water. If you go to freshwater, like a lake, it's typically phosphorus. If you go to the ocean, it's mostly nitrogen. Sometimes it's metals, but it's mostly nitrogen. If you go to forests, it's a combination of nitrogen and phosphorus. So limiting nutrients, again, limit how much primary production, how much plants can do what they're doing. And so, as we've sort of mentioned, ecosystems are typically shaped by their abiotic conditions. So the water, the wind, all that stuff, that's what typically shapes what an ecosystem is. But ecosystems can also be shaped by their biology overall. And you can think about something like a coral reef. A coral reef can dramatically change the abiotic conditions of an area, which would change the biology as well. But when we're thinking about communities, communities are typically shaped by species interactions, and they also evolve with one another. So there is this sort of crosstalk between a community and an ecosystem. And again, a community is a bunch of different species living together. But before we sort of go on to this idea of communities, I just want to briefly talk about sort of two quick topics. The first is this idea of biodiversity and ecosystem functioning. And so biodiversity simply refers to how many different species you have in a given area. And so this really interesting phenomena in nature is when you have very, very biodiverse or very, very species rich or very, very many species living in a given area, it makes ecosystems function better. And so I want you to keep this in the back of your mind for next class, but there's this really interesting phenomenon in nature where if you have a lot of species, ecosystems function better. And this all ties back to this idea of traits. More species diversity means you have more trait diversity. If you have more traits, well, that means your communities can do more, right? So if you have a bunch of different traits, that means your communities have greater capacity to do things. And this sort of the other interesting thing is if you have a lot of traits, if you say get hit with a drought, you're more likely to bounce back from that drought or bounce back faster from that drought. And so the idea being here is this very sort of old experiment where you can look at phytoplankton, so just microscopic photosynthetic organisms in a lake. And you can look at just a community with one species in it, and it has very, very low nutrient removal. Now, if we change that phytoplankton community to have multiple species, well, we increase nutrient removal efficiency. And so this is the idea. By adding more species, we can do the same exact process, but do it better and do it faster. And we see this all across the planet. More species in an area, better functioning ecosystems. And like I said, keep this in mind for tomorrow when we talk about what happens when we lose biodiversity at the global level, because we are losing biodiversity at the global level, and you might be sad by tomorrow's class. But I would be remiss if I didn't mention sort of another sort of aspect of ecosystems is how humans influence them. And we do this at a scale that is never before seen. And these include a number of different things, including overexploitation, polluting natural areas with nutrients or even waste, how we introduce new species to area, deforestation, so changing land use, changing the flow of rivers or altering the flow of rivers, which leads to increased sedimentation. And as we'll talk about soon enough, we're affecting this at a global scale with climate change as well. So humans have pretty dramatic effects on ecosystems. And that can be, again, directly on the biology, or it can be directly on the conditions present. Because you can imagine if you deforest an area, well, that's no longer the same ecosystem, right? It's pretty different. And so one of the sort of interesting things about ecosystems is that you can actually physically put a dollar value on ecosystems. And when you start to think about it, it's a really big number. And so if you try to put a dollar value on all ecosystems across the planet, it's actually valued at about $150 trillion. So put that in perspective, $150 trillion is the value of all the ecosystems across the planet. Now, I don't know about you guys, but $1 trillion is a ton of money. That is a lot of money. It's not like $1 billion or $1 million. $1 trillion is the size of multiple economies across the planet, right? So $1 trillion is a lot of value. And it provides all this value to humans through 4 key services that were defined by the United Nations Millennial Ecosystem Assessment. And the 4 categories that we think about in terms of ecosystems and their values and what value they provide to humans. Because again, if ecosystem is going to be valuable, it has to provide something to humans, right? In terms of a dollar value, not like a natural value, but a dollar value. And these 4 services are provisioning services, regulating services, cultural services, and supporting services. So we're going to talk about those briefly. First one is provisioning services. So this is physical goods we take from the natural world. And so these are direct and that have direct and marketable benefits to human in the form of raw materials or goods. And these include water, food, timber, plant fiber, natural gas, oil, and medicines. So these are things we physically take from nature and we use. And as you all probably know, these things cost money, right? You don't just get water for free, unfortunately. Water costs money, right? You don't just get food, you cost money, right? You don't get wood, it costs money, right? So there is a direct value of these things. And unfortunately, some of these things are, more valuable than others, but and unfortunately, sort of one, in the case of water, it's something that should be free because, as we all know, water is, a vital service to all life, but is heavily monetized. So this is our provisioning services, things you directly take from the environment. Next up is regulating services. So these are essentially help ecosystems stay healthy. And the idea being is with these present, ecosystems help maintain their integrity, help maintain their function. And these include things like pollination, decomposition, purification of water and air, flood control, erosion control, sequestration of carbon, as well as the regulation of climate. So these all help keep ecosystems healthy. These also directly benefit us. So for instance, pollination is a $500 billion a year industry for humans. Again, all provided naturally by nature. Water and air purification, again, natural services, but directly benefit us. But these also help keep these ecosystems functioning sort of normally and healthy. So that's regulating services, keeping the ecosystems going, which directly benefits humans. We have cultural services next, and this is non-material benefits that advances our development of people. And these are typical things like recreation, art, music, architecture that's inspired by nature, anything spiritual, as well as what you guys are doing right this very second, and that is science education. And so this is essentially our connection with nature. There's a very famous entomologist, so a guy that studies insects at Harvard. His name is E.O. Wilson. You may have heard of him before. He came up with this concept of biophilia. The biophilia hypothesis, which is essentially humans' intrinsic connection to nature. We don't really like to think we're in connection with nature, or we don't think we're sort of, subject to nature, but we are, again, linked directly to nature. So there's this idea that we get things from nature spiritually or visually that do have some overall value to humans. And last up is this idea of supporting services and services that essentially allow the production of other ecosystem services. And these are things we've talked about, including photosynthesis, nutrient cycling, and some other things that we haven't really talked about, including soil formation, the cycling of water, and habitat formation. And essentially, this is the building blocks of all those other three services I've mentioned. Without these things, we wouldn't have, regulation. We wouldn't have beautiful landscapes for people to look at or swim in beautiful oceans, right? We wouldn't have pollination or decomposition, and we wouldn't have all these services if it wasn't for sort of these backbone ones of, again, photosynthesis, the cycling of nutrients, and things like that. So these are sort of overall things that we get from nature, that have a value from nature, that nature just naturally sort of provides. And again, that value is pretty valuable. And again, you can put a value on ecosystems, and you can also think about, well, if your ecosystems are being threatened, as we'll talk about tomorrow, they are being threatened, you could potentially put a price tag on those ecosystems to potentially save them. And so, as I've mentioned, the value of ecosystems worldwide, in 2011, it was about was 125 trillion. Nowadays, again, it's about 150 trillion dollars. That's the value of ecosystems worldwide. And depending on where you are, some ecosystems are more valuable than others. So seagrass beds are very valuable at $19,000 per hectare. So just a hectare is just a fancy way of saying 2.5 acres. So this is like a scientific way of saying it. Wetlands are about $14,000 per hectare. And you can calculate how much any ecosystem is worth by looking at what services they provide and essentially saying, okay, if you have an ecosystem, what is it worth, by saying, what does it provide to us? Now, sort of one of the interesting things is if you look at sort of the value of our ecosystems relative to, say, a crop field, well, a crop field is significantly less valuable than a seagrass bed or a wetland. So the average value of a hectare of crops is about $2,000. And that's in contrast to the value of a hectare of seagrass, which is about $19,000. So natural systems are very, very valuable simply because of all those services they provide to us. And you can put a price tag on this. Again, I gave you that $150 trillion thing. But one of the things that happens if you sort of put a price tag on an ecosystem, it does lead to monetization or potentially commodification. And the idea being is, should you put a price tag on nature? And people have varying levels of ideas on that, but there has been put a value on nature. I gave you the 150 trillion thing, but we know that nature is valuable, right? If you know how the fishing industry works, you know that nature is valuable to the fishing industry, right? If you live on the coast, you know that the health of the coastline is important for protecting you from storm surge, right? So there is a value on nature, and you can put a value on it. And again, it's all a combination of these values that we've been talking about, direct use, taking things, indirect use by, say, preventing storm surge and things like that. So you can put a value on an ecosystem. And if you have an ecosystem that is potentially deteriorated, you could potentially use that monetary value to convince people to fix an ecosystem. And so one of the sort of the interesting cases of this that we're going to briefly talk about is the Florida Everglades. And the Florida Everglades is really, really beautiful. It's called the River of Grass because it essentially is all this you can see here in this picture. It's just this grass, this massive groves of grass and trees, and rivers flow through them. And so it is called the River of Grass. It's a really beautiful area. It provides lots of services. It filters lots and lots of water. It sequesters carbon. It's home to tons and tons of wildlife, including alligators and manatees and all sorts of other birds and things like that. And it provides lots and lots of recreation and cultural as well as scientific activity. So the Everglades is kind of a sort of an important area of Florida. And so this is the Everglades. If you sort of have never sort of seen where the Everglades is, it's this very large water basin in Florida. It starts off sort of, 1/3 or half of the way up Florida. And it's essentially this long river that flows out to the Gulf of Mexico as well as the Atlantic Ocean. Now, the idea being is that this is what it looked like historically. Because humans moved in, and we have cities like Orlando and all the cities that are here that I can't really think of because I only know Orlando and Miami, and then all the other places up here like Tallahassee and stuff like that. Because of all the development of Florida, which is one of the most heavily developed states in the country, there's been lots and lots of water diversion to create housing, urban areas, and agriculture, which has led to a pretty dramatic change in the flow of the Florida Everglades. And this happened over a very short period of time. It took, 15 to 20 years to change the flow of the river of the Florida Everglades from this way with many natural drainage points to essentially only 2 drainage points and no real major drainage at the bottom. So you see this really dramatic change in water flow of the Florida Everglades. Now, you can imagine that changing that level of ecosystem had some pretty dramatic effects. And you would be right. You would be 100% right. And what this has led to is essentially a pretty heavy desecration of the ecosystem and the services this ecosystem provides. So one of the things we're seeing is there's this very special type of ecosystem in the Florida Everglades called the pine rockland. And this is actually an endangered ecosystem, meaning there's very few pockets of this ecosystem left. It's essentially almost eradicated from the planet. So we've almost lost an entire ecosystem type because we've redirected the water in the Florida Everglades. In addition, it's negatively affecting surrounding habitats. So you can imagine by diverting all this water, well, you're affecting all these other habitats you're creating along the way. So you're restricting water, which is restricting potential habitats that could be there. But this has also had a lot of effects on the biology. So for instance, there's used to be fisheries for bonefish and tarpons. This is what a bonefish looks like. And which, again, we're losing animals in a system which has effects on the biology, but it also has direct effects on the fishing industry. Bonefish and tarpon were a pretty heavy commodity. They were about $1 billion a year industry in Florida. They're no longer there. So there was a major loss of revenue. And so in this case, the direct cost to this fishing industry was pretty big. So the question is, can we sort of use this monetary value that we've tried to assign to ecosystems? Can we use it to restore an ecosystem? And the idea being ecosystem restoration is reactionary, meaning you're fixing the mistakes of the past. And so Congress in 2000 enacted a 50-year plan called the CERP, or the Comprehensive Everglade Restoration Plan, to restore the Everglades, to try to make the Everglades back to what they were. Because again, ecosystems have a value, both direct to humans as well as to sort of naturally how these ecosystems function. So can we restore the Everglades to make them better? And sort of the interesting thing is we can look at this nice table provided by SERP. And we can see that so this is the summary of ecosystem services of recreation, fishing, and open spaces. And then wildlife hunting and habitat. And so you can see the values of these are in the billions, right? Just for groundwater purification, that's a $13 billion a year, $13 billion over, again, a 50-year period of value, right? This is how much direct monetary value it's providing. And so the total value of services for restoring the Everglades was about $46 billion. That's in contrast to our investment. So the SERP was awarded $11.5 billion from the federal government, which means that there was if we look at the cost to benefit ratio here, it's a 4.4. So for every dollar we invested, the state of Florida was getting $4 back. So you can see just by restoring an ecosystem, you can get a lot of money out of it. Because ecosystems are valued, whether it's indirectly by purifying groundwater or directly by essentially providing a very valuable fishing industry, right? So ecosystems have value. The way they are, their abiotic conditions, the way they are, they provide direct and indirect values to us. And so you can potentially restore an ecosystem and get a lot of value out of it, both direct and indirect. So the take-home message from the Florida Everglades and the take-home message for ecosystems is they are dynamic systems that connect tens of billions of dollars every year. And that's a lot of money to take away from the system, right? If you destroy the ecosystem surrounding Massachusetts, that's billions of dollars in tax revenue that's not coming in. That's not going to fixing our roads. That's not going to providing education, healthcare, things like that. So the value of ecosystems directly influences your everyday life. And so keeping them healthy, keeping them functioning the way they are, or potentially restoring them does provide a very valuable sort of service to us. And again, it's all directly tied to keeping that abiotic and biotic conditions sort of functioning, coming together, because again, there is a direct benefit to humans. So that's ecosystems. Let's get a little bit smaller. Let's think about communities, which again are just groups of species living together. And these species can interact either directly or indirectly. And as with any sort of population or any group or any area, you can have immigration and migration. So coming to and from the population. So communities are not sort of static through time. You can have immigration and migration from them. And so the first sort of topic we're going to speak about when we're thinking about a community is this idea of a niche. And a niche is essentially the space an organism occupies, which includes its physical space, its resources, as well as its mating. And so if we think about sort of, the niche of an eagle, right? So we have a bald eagle here in our image. This bald eagle has its food that it eats. So the rodents and rabbits and things like that. That's its food. It has its space, right? It has a territory where it lives in. So, dozens and dozens of miles around it that it's its own space. And it has its mates, right? So in this case, we have a male coming to mate with a female, or its mate here in their nest. There is that physical requirement. And then there's sort of the other requirements like water and stuff like that. But this is the niche, right? What it's doing, the space it occupies, the resources it's consuming. And that's what an organism's niche is. Niches themselves are not mutually exclusive. And so niches can be occupied by multiple different organisms. So you can have two species of eagles that have very similar niches that do have some overlap. And when you have that overlap, it does lead to what's called competition between these organisms. Um, and we can have sort of two different avenues that we can see here. So when you have two niches that overlap, we can have what's called competitive exclusion, where one taxa completely outcompetes the other. So it essentially drives the other taxa away. And then we can also have what's called resource partitioning, where each taxa essentially alters the environment, dividing the resources that they're competing over within that niche. Now, the idea being is when we have competitive exclusion, if we have, say, two hypothetical species of microeukaryotic organisms living in a test tube, well, under competitive exclusion, purple guy kills green guy here. So he outcompetes them, makes it so green guy starves to death. That's in contrast to resource partitioning, where they essentially live together, but they slightly modify their niche. So say green guy is eating one food source and purple guy is eating another food source. So same niche, but they're essentially partitioning out so that they can live in essentially not, you could think about it as like living in harmony. So, and just as a sort of note, when we think about sort of this idea of niches, it does directly tie back to evolution. And so remember that evolution acts upon everything big and small, and it's all about the environment selecting. Now, what evolution naturally does is it will essentially push organisms to different resources. Now, if you have two species of finch here, right, and you have some sort of, they're on the same, if they're on two different islands, they're eating the same resource, right? If you bring those two birds together, they're now then competing over that same food source. Now, what evolution will tell you, what evolution will essentially push is the diversification of traits. The idea being is that you'll have organisms, depending on the size of their beak in this case, well, they'll start to specialize on bigger or even smaller seeds. Again, evolution, natural selection, selecting for traits that allow you to occupy a new niche. Again, this niche here being food source, that will essentially push this species apart, right? Essentially, evolution it fosters competition, but it also encourages essentially separation, right? In a sort of a survival of the fittest sense, if there was just one seed source on this island, whichever organism was best adapted, so had the best traits, would win out, displacing the other. But what natural selection does allow for, and most commonly happens, you'll have a specialization. So when we think about our finches again, specialization here is in the beak, allowing them to specialize on different food sources here. So just when you thought evolution was gone, it comes right back into your face, because again, evolution is a sort of a key theme of biology here. It touches every aspect of what we're thinking about in this class. In addition, so when organisms have an overlapping niche, we get competition, and competition has led to sort of the evolution of some pretty cool defense mechanisms. And so organisms have multiple defense mechanisms out there. Some are cool, some are gross, some are not that exciting. And so organisms typically respond in one of two ways. They either hide or escape. So you can imagine if a shark comes through, you just swim away from the shark, and that's your defensive behavior. You can also imagine if you're a fish, well, you do what's called, you school and you ball up. The idea being, in this scenario, you have, by being in large numbers, the probability of you being eaten is very low. So that's hiding or escaping. You can also fight back. So in the case of this gross bird, it's vomiting on a potential predator to keep the predator away. That's why I said some of these are pretty gross. But there has all sorts of defensive mechanisms that have evolved over the planet. These include mechanical things. So we can look at the porcupine. It's got these nice spikes that prevents another organisms from chomping down on him. We have physical chemical defenses. So we have poison arrow frogs here that produce a viscous chemical that prevents things from eating it. Very, very toxic. We have warning coloration. So for instance, the monarch butterfly here has this beautiful bright color. It's warning things around it. Hey, I got a very nasty chemical in me. If you eat me, you'll die. So that's warning coloration. This frog over here is also displaying warning coloration as well. And then the final type of behavior is actually physical camouflage. So you can see this praying mantis here. It's perfectly camouflaged into it looks essentially like just another part of this tree. Um, and then if you have a few moments, I think it's like a 30-second video, please take a peek at this YouTube video of this crazy mechanism of defense. It's a insect called the bombardier beetle. It's really, really cool. If you, like I said, if you have 30 seconds, take a peek at it somewhere down the line. But there's all sorts of predation out there that organisms have to be wary of, and you can defend yourself. You can also potentially develop this concept of called mimicry, and evolve essentially allows you to evolve structure that essentially increases your capacity to compete. So you're developing new traits that allow you to compete. And so in the case we have this anglerfish here, it's evolved this luminous structure here to trick its prey from coming in to come in so it can eat them. There's also mimicry that will essentially camouflage, like say a spider to look like an ant, so things will leave it alone. So there's all sorts of ways organisms can mimic things naturally to get a competitive advantage here. Another really common strategy is parasitism, where essentially an organism will hitch a ride on a host. And so we can think of something like we have what's called an ectoparasite. So these are parasites that live on the skin or the outside of the host. And these can be as benign as, say, we have a red velvet mite here. So this is just something that's hitching a ride to go from one place to the next. It's not eating you at all. Related to red velvet mites are ticks. So ticks are ectoparasites that feed on your blood. They do cause harm to you. So those are ectoparasites. We also have what are called endoparasites, and those are parasites that live inside you. Not principally, they can live pretty much anywhere. They can live in your brain, they can live in your stomach, they can live in your colon, they can live in your skin, they can live in your blood, they can be anywhere. Typically things that live inside you are detrimental. There's very few things that live inside you that don't cause harm. Even things like tapeworms, which might not cause any harm in the short term, can cause some pretty deleterious side effects in the long term. So these are our parasites. And sort of interesting thing parasites they have all sorts of crazy strategies. And so, for instance, the rabies virus is a parasite. It actually modifies the behavior of those infected by rabies, causing them to become very aggressive, which will essentially help the parasite pass from dog 1 to dog 2 or dog to raccoon or whatever. So parasites can dramatically modify the host to essentially change the biology of the host to make it better for the parasite. And then we have next up our less depressing things, which are commensalism as well as mutualism. And so these are negative, essentially non-negative species interaction. So in contrast to parasitism or predation. So mutualism, where you have two organisms interact in a positive way. So we've talked about pollination in this case, where the bee here is getting some nice, delicious nectar from this plant, and the plant is then using the bee to pollinate other flowers. So this is our mutualism, where both organisms are directly benefiting. This is in contrast to commensalism, where one species benefits and the other is neither hurt or benefits at all. And so the idea, we have this bird hitching a ride on this water buffalo here. It's not hurting the water buffalo, but the bird is getting some benefits out of it by getting a ride. It's getting a vantage point. It's getting safety. So these are sort of two other categories here. And we can sort of distill all these interactions we've talked about into a nice little table. So we have species 1, species 2, and we have, so 0 means no interaction, plus means positive interaction, and the minus sign means a negative interaction. And so there's all sorts of types of interactions here that cause harm or benefit or no effect on one host or the other. So this is just sort of a nice table that sort of summarizes all these interactions. It also includes some other types, including allelopathy, which we're not really going to talk about, but it's when one organism is not harmed or gets no benefit, but it directly harms another organism. And there's also other ones, again, competition, where both organisms are hurt, predation, where one benefits and the other is harmed, and so on and so forth. So this is just a nice little table that summarizes all those sort of interactions communities can have. Because again, we're talking about communities, and communities are all about how things interact. Now, all these different interaction types lead to what we call a food web. I'm sure you guys have all heard this at some shape or form, but food webs is basically how energy flows through ecosystems, how all these different types of interactions shape how energy flows through these ecosystems. And again, the energy is chemical energy. So the idea being it all starts with sunlight, and that's taken up by plants and goes from there, right? So we talked about how energy moves, right? Plants are eaten by consumers, and consumers are eaten by consumers, and this all leads to a flowing of energy to the ecosystem, eventually leading to things dying, and that all being worked back into the system. So all these interactions at a community level, again, all different species living together, lead to this interconnected food web, which really, again, is all about how energy moves through these systems. But it's also not just energy. Remember, it's about how carbon moves. It's about how nitrogen moves. It's about how phosphorus moves. So everything is moving through these systems, through how these species in these communities interact with one another. And the way these are the photosynthesizers. So bottom-up control refers to essentially the way the community, the amount of biomass that is produced at each one of these levels is regulated by how well the bottom of the ladder is doing. So remember, everything starts off by coming into our photosynthesizers, right? Which are then eaten by bigger things, and they're eaten by bigger things, and so on and so forth, right? That flow of energy. Now, in a bottom-up situation, again, how much biomass we have at each level above it is controlled by how much original biomass we produce here. Now, if you remember back to earlier part of this lecture, I talked about limiting resources. And so this bottom-up control is how much biomass you produce at the bottom is essentially regulated by how much resources you have, right? Whatever that limiting nutrient is. So if we're in a desert, how much physical plant biomass you produce is limited by water, right? If I have a lot of water, I produce a lot of biomass. If I have a lot of biomass here, it means I can have a lot of biomass here and here and here. This is what we mean by bottom-up controls. It's essentially controlled by how much resources are available, which in turn regulates how much photosynthetic biomass we have, which controls how much biomass we have. Because the idea being is if we have a lot of biomass here, we can support a lot of much larger biomass. Now that's in contrast to what we call top-down control, which is controlled by consumers. So the idea being is if we have an ecosystem where we have these ecosystems are controlled by, say, a seal in this case. Well, if we lose biomass of a seal, that will lead to an increase in the biomass of the fish. And if you have more fish biomass, well, that's going to essentially mean there's less biomass of zooplankton. So their biomass is going to go down, which in turn means that the zooplankton, which are eating all the phytoplankton or the photosynthesizers, their biomass is going to go up. So by essentially changing the behavior of something on the top, we modify essentially the biomass at the bottom levels here. So this is top-down control. Changing how many predators you have or the behavior of the predators can directly impact things below it. So these are the way communities, the populations within the communities are controlled. They're either controlled directly through how much primary producer biomass, or they're directly controlled by the actions of the predator. So one of the two ways is the way the population sizes are controlled. But as we've mentioned, not all interactions between species are negative. And so some are positive, some are neutral, right? But sort of one of the interesting things is some species, and so I'm sorry, let me take a step back. Humans also fit into this equation, right? So we can have negative side effects on our populations in nature, right? If we take too much fish, we hurt their population. But we can also have positive effects, right? So dumping lots of our sewage into oceans increases the amount of photosynthetic biomass. So humans can have a sort of a role in here as well. And humans do have a direct role in how species interact, how communities work. And so sort of a definition, we have what's called a cosmopolitan species. And this is a species with a very wide distribution. So it's something that's found in many parts of the world. It can also be something that's non-native, so something that's not naturally found in a location. And we'll talk about this tomorrow. But an example of this is the squirrel or the mouse, right? It's a very cosmopolitan species. You find these across the globe. You find them in many different habitats in many different regions. So one of the things that humans have done that's kind of interesting in the way we're changing communities is creating urban environments, which is creating these all new homes for very many species. It's creating all sorts of new ways to make species interact with one another in a community. And one of the sort of interesting things that's happening is that many plants and animals are rapidly adapting and even evolving to these new urban environments. And one of the reasons this is, or a couple of the reasons this is because there's less predators in early urban environments, right? You don't see very many, jaguars walking around cities, right? You don't see that. There's much more abundant food and much more calorie dense resources inside cities, right? So think about a mouse chowing down on some dominoes, very very resource intensive. And there's also a lot of habitat. And so you think about cities, they're dynamic, right? They have lots and lots of levels to them. So there's all sorts of potentials for habitats, all sorts of potentials for new interactions and new species. And as thus, these animals have adapted and even evolved to live inside of our cities. So if you look at a pigeon, right? A pigeon and a dove are the exact same species of animal, but pigeons live inside cities. Have you ever seen a pigeon? You know they can get huge. They look very different. Their behavior is very different. Now, if you look at a dove that lives in more natural environments, they look completely different. They behave very different. And the reason they are different is because pigeons live in cities. Doves live in natural environments. And this urban environment has caused all sorts of changes in the way these species interact with one another, the way they interact with their environment, because it's a whole brand new ecosystem. It's really cool. So this idea is what we call urban ecology, how organisms are adapted. And just as a note, you can see some crazy things. So there's a really interesting raccoon that comes around, and it comes around. It likes to stare inside the house, and it tries to get food from us, and we try to leave food out for it. And so just us being here has changed the behavior of this raccoon. It's pretty cute too. So. Well, actually, she's pretty cute. Raccoon has been colloquially named Rhonda. So, and this is all just sort of leading to this idea is that animals are adapting their behavior, they're evolving, they're changing to live with us. And they oftentimes will do better when living with us. So organisms that typically live near humans or with humans, they typically live longer and reproduce much more fast than their wild counterparts. And it's kind of interesting. And so some people have been studying this, and it seems to be, as I mentioned, this evolutionary adaptation. And it's sort of this ongoing thing where organisms are adapting to living in sort of urban environments. They're evolving in response to changes in this ecosystem that we're putting forth. And so, for instance, there's these Antillean bullfinches that have been studied. They're becoming much more craftier than their rural counterparts. So Antillean bullfishes have been known to bust open sugar packets and carry sugar packets away because they've learned that sugar packets are a delicious source of nutrients, whereas their wild counterparts won't actually physically do that. So humans are putting a really interesting evolutionary pressure on organisms. And again, they're all changing these communities. They're changing the way these interact. And so you could ask yourself is, if we're doing all these things to benefit animals, right? We're creating this habitat, we're creating these food sources, they're living longer, they're producing more. Should we build more cities? The answer to that is no. But we do need to acknowledge that animals are part of cities, and we do need to sort of maximize our efforts to support biodiversity, not just naturally speaking, but also biodiversity in cities. So this includes more parks in cities, better building top gardens and stuff like that, to attract animals into more natural habitats as opposed to living, in sewers and, stuff like that. Or you could think of something kind of crazy and funky like this. It's in Japan, if I'm not mistaken, of this really interesting tree-esque garden they've created where you have all this natural vine habitat and you have these sort of tree mimicking structures that provide all this really good habitat for animals to live in. So regardless of what we do, we're never going to sort of get rid of this sort of link between humans and nature, but we could potentially make this better, make the interactions between communities and species better, make this overall sort of feel much more natural. And so that's our sort of the gist of thinking about communities, thinking about how they interact. Just one last thing before we go for the day, it's going to be this idea of ecological succession. And we sort of think about, what's in nature as being static, but nature is pretty dynamic. It changes pretty dramatically, even over short periods of time. So you can think about, if I cut down a forest, well, that forest will eventually come back in some shape or form, but it has to undergo what we call an ecological succession. So the idea being is if we have the case of, again, clear cutting a forest, well, we have some sort of succession that occurs. So after I cut down the forest, I don't have trees, I don't have animals. The first thing that come and colonize are fungi, bacteria, and lichens, and then we have small seeds that pop up. And then over time, things get bigger and bigger and more complex, leading to essentially a fully grown forest coming to be, in a couple decades. But there is this level of succession, and this is common across all ecosystems. Ecosystems change over time. Communities change over time. So there is a predictable succession that we're not going to talk about, but I just wanted to sort of make that known that communities do change over time, ecosystems change over time, and the biology does change in a manner that is a bit predictable overall. So with that, we're going to that'll be the end of the class for the day. If you have any questions on anything, please let me know. Otherwise, I hope you guys have a great day, and I will see you tomorrow.